This Veterans History Project interview is with Colonel Dan Roper, United States Army retired, on November the 7th, 2024, at the Association of United States Army in Arlington, Virginia. Colonel Roper, to begin, thank you for your many years of service to our nation and to the Army. And would you please tell us how many years you served in the Army, in what rank and what position of responsibility did you retire?
Thanks for having me, Mark. I served in the U.S. Army for over 29 years, retired as a colonel, and then at that point in time, I was the director of the Army Counterinsurgency Center.
Very good. And would you please share with us a bit about your childhood and your parents, the schools and colleges you attended, and what led you to serve in the Army?
I grew up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and was there till I was 16 years old, and then we moved to New Hampshire. All my relatives came from Gloucester, and that's where I did not exactly take to the thinking about the military was not top of mind at that point in time. And when another point on that is all my relatives who lived in Gloucester, had all served in either World War I, World War II, Korea, or in the Cold War, just for the period of enlistment or the period of the war, and then came home and lived their lives. So service was understood. It was part of who everybody was, at least in the circle that I was privileged to be in. But it was not, nobody had an interest in the career. When I started the college application process and applied to a bunch of schools, I wound up applying to West Point, but I really had no specific desire to go there. It was just one of the other schools. It was a little bit different. I didn't understand how different it was at that point, but I was to eventually find out. When I was in high school, I was talking to my parents and they were asking me which of the schools that I'd been accepted at was I interested in going to. And I said, well, West Point had accepted me at this point. And I decided I didn't want to do it. And they said, oh, why is that? Because they weren't driving me to do it. They just wanted me to explore options. And as a very bright 17-year-old boy, I said, I don't want anybody telling me what to do. And their eyes sort of popped out of their heads and said, exactly what job do you think you're not going to have somebody telling you what to do? And so my argument was over with. And I thought about that for a while and ultimately decided to go to West Point, not just because of the academics, but because it'd be physically demanding, physically challenging and interesting. You'd get to do military things, which all sounded pretty exciting to me at that point. And you're thrown into leadership situations and they spend a lot of time helping educate you and develop you as a leader, which that's going to be important no matter what phase of your life what you're going to do after your 5-year commitment. And I went to West Point fully expecting just to be in the Army for 5 years upon completion if I survived West Point. And then while I was there, some things happened that upon reflection started to make me more committed to thinking about the Army as a big pursuit in my life. Well, during my 4 years at West Point, the Iranian hostage crisis started in 1979 when 52 Americans were trapped in the Iranian embassy and they were held captives for 444 days. And one of the things that happened when they were released, the first place they were sent by President Reagan was to West Point. And every cadet in the Corps lined up along the road as they were driving through with their buses with their families. Wow. And that was an incredibly emotional experience for everybody. And it was a reminder of this is something bigger than just an education. If we were to be the first stop, that the nation had been absolutely paralyzed by that crisis for those 444 days, that the military really stands for something that's respected and is of great value. And ironically, the beginning part of my time at West Point is when the Operation Desert One occurred, the operation at Desert One, trying to rescue the hostages when there was helicopters crashed into each other and 8 American service members died in a national humiliation that pretty much marked the end of President Carter's presidency, even though he was in office for another year and a half. And we were immediately, when the news came out about that, our tactical officer, the officer in charge of my company, had us all come to the day room and watch the news, because he was one of those guys. He had served with them, so he knew who they were. And it imparted, okay, obviously there are costs in this business, so you really need to understand what you're doing and what risks you're taking. And that was a mission that there was so much enthusiasm to do it. They didn't get a chance to coordinate it correctly prior to being a joint force. And our U.S. military has spent a lot of time correcting that. So again, just a couple, experiences that just sort of made me realize this is kind of a special profession, that one needs to be committed to it. And there's so much more riding on it than just an individual getting their education.
Thank you very much for explaining. And could you tell us a little bit about, as you progressed through your 4 years at West Point, and then you become commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army, tell us a little bit about the branching process, or how you selected your specialty, and then tell us about the training, the initial training you went to after graduation and commissioning into the Army, please.
Some of the training one gets at West Point in the summers exposes them to all the different branches of the Army, and it's great because you can talk about how the branches are like, but until you're doing it, being trained by actual soldiers, you can't quite visualize it. I really enjoyed all that training, but in particular the field artillery training with firing the cannons. But it's not just firing the cannons, it's calculating the data to put on the cannons, it's running the guns, and it's deciding where to shoot. I found that to be a very interesting combination of skills that one needed to acquire to actually identify a target and then engage it before it engages you. And so I chose artillery as the branch that I'd be. And then my first assignment after going through officer basic course in Oklahoma was with 101st Airborne Division Air Assault at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where I spent 3.5 years in an artillery battalion, primarily doing the fire direction and the battery executive officer, who's the individual who controls the guns in a firing battery, and had a great experience. In the 101st, at that time in particular, there were just all kinds of helicopters available to train with your equipment. And again, it wasn't an optional thing, but every time we went to the field, we could fly our howitzers out to the field, set them down quickly, shoot, get picked back up by howitzers, and move on to the next firing point. I found that to be a very exciting way to spend my days and nights. And after a while, I really couldn't believe we actually get paid to do this. And it was like, are you kidding me? We get to, ride around, fly around, rappel out of helicopters, and then shoot the guns. And again, I'm glad they did pay us. That worked out better in the long run, but it was really an invigorating experience. But another thing happened when I was at Fort Campbell is there was a crash in 1985 of a plane that came back from the Sinai, the multinational force and observers, that had 248 soldiers from the 101st on that plane after they'd been performing a peacekeeping mission for 6 months. And it crashed when they were coming back home, and it crashed in Gander, Canada. And it literally ripped the heart out of that division temporarily, but like everybody on post and all the communities around it rallied, and it was very moving. It was very difficult for everybody there, but the community and the community around Fort Campbell all pulled together to try to heal that wound. Obviously, the loss of the soldiers is not something that's never going to be replaced, but it shows you the importance of resilience and understanding that people are there for a deeper calling than just themselves.
Yes, thank you for explaining. And as you reflect back on your first assignment with the 101st Airborne Division, your first platoon, would you share with us a little bit about your platoon sergeant and your NCOs and the leadership skills that they demonstrated and how that impacted you, please?
My first NCO was a staff sergeant, and I was on the battalion. I was the battalion S1, the adjutant, because I had been injured in training prior to that, so I couldn't move around in the field as much. So that made sense from the battalion officer management perspective. And in a battalion S1 section, again, think personnel, in the personnel administration center, all the soldier issues were handled as far as people that had pay issues, issues with the promotions being posted, the awards being presented. And when soldiers would come to him, and this is my platoon, the pack supervisor, essentially
Yes.
the platoon sergeant, and oftentimes soldiers might have an issue with something because they don't know how the system works. It's not necessarily intuitive. And somebody would come to him, he would be, I can picture him right now, listening to the soldier talk and then talking to him like a big brother talking to a little brother, but not coddling him, making sure that he understood what the soldier understood what the standard was and what he needed to do, what his responsibility was. And then a little bit sternly, and initially I was thinking he was being a little rough, and it wasn't, because the soldier would not walk away without the solution in hand. And that's part of it. Just showed me it's a little bit of tough love, and it wasn't anything excessive at all, but it just didn't seem too sympathetic. But by the time the soldier walked away from him, that soldier would run through fire to save him. So and it was a lesson that kind of kept growing on me throughout my time in the Army. It's to become a resilient unit, to become more effective, to be able to do your mission. The starting position is you don't just treat your soldiers nicely and make them happy and give everybody a cupcake every day or something. It's the best form of morale for soldiers that make them want to be in the Army is tough, realistic training.
Yes.
Where they know what the standard is, and they have to work hard to get to it. If it's easy, that's not satisfying. And this was just one example of thousands of times I've seen that in action. And it was, as you go into different units, everybody's got their own personality. I mean, again, they're all soldiers, and officers are soldiers, but sometimes people are trying to be Mr. Nice Guy, or like just nice without, hey, we're here for a mission. We've got, we're going on the field, and we're going to depend on each other. So these things are inextricably linked on taking care of people and getting the mission done. And if you don't do them both, you're going to do neither. So again, that was just a great beginning of my education in the U.S. Army. I'm still getting educated in the U.S. Army, and it's been a few years since I started.
Thank you very much. Excellent example. And then what came next to you as you began within your career, so to speak, your early part of your career? What came next?
But after going to the Officer Advanced course, after 3.5 years at Fort Campbell, and a couple extra courses related to artillery systems, and I went to West Germany at the time in the 8th Infantry Division in the Baumholder Eder Oberstein area in the western part of West Germany, where my main job there was as a battery commander of a 155 millimeter howitzer battery, nuclear capable, that was, had a mission up on the General Defense Plan border, the inter-German border, along with all the other Army units. We had a place where we'd have to train and deploy there should there be a contingency. Great experience. Spent a lot of time in the field, naturally, and field artillery, one shouldn't be surprised that they spend a lot of time in the field. And but one of the most interesting things that happened there was when it was during our big annual evaluation, we shot a lot of fire missions at Grafenwehr training area, the big training area in Germany. And then after shooting, we went out into what used to be called maneuver rights area, which means maneuvering the unit around the countryside and into the positions that you would move into if the Soviets were going to come across the border. The Soviets are the Czechs in that area. And while we're doing this, the Berlin Wall fell. That we were aware of this. I mean, obviously, just the overall news was kind of carrying this. And our whole time at Grafenwehr was maybe 4 weeks in November of 1989. So by the time we finished up our training, recovered the equipment, loaded it up on trains, and either sent it back on trains, and then I was in the convoy that was convoying back from Grafenwehr to our home station all the way across Germany. So it's a long convoy. So we're convoying down the Autobahn, which is the main highways in Germany. They're called Autobahns. That you can go really fast if you've got a souped up BMW. Not so fast if you're in howitzers or Humvees. But while we're going down, there were literally hundreds of cars that were flying as fast as they could to go west that had come across the Czech border, full of families of picture a car about the size of a Mini Cooper with 12 people in it, hanging out the window, blowing kisses and, thanking every vehicle that they passed. It was just really, and it's like, again, this is another one of those, why do we do this?
Right.
And people look at U.S. soldiers around the world and know that means something. I mean, everything isn't perfect, and sometimes things are wrong, but they know what they stand for. And that was, again, it was absolutely fantastic. Normally a convoy back and trying to keep all your vehicles straight is a major headache. But this was fun. It was just people just be beeping their horn and, again, literally thanking every American they possibly could. And you could tell they're just driving that car until it ran out of gas. And that the further away they could get from the border, the happier they would be. And I'm sure that's where most of them are today, is wherever the vehicle broke down, they are probably very happy citizens of Germany or further west, wherever they went. But that was a real fun part of being in Germany at that time and serving in the U.S. Army.
What a great example. Thank you for sharing. And then what came next for you?
After that, it was time to come out of the field, and the Army sent me to graduate school, the Naval Postgraduate School to get a degree in nuclear physics. And so I was there for a couple of years, and after that I did a follow-on assignment in the Pentagon and the Army staff, working policy related to nuclear and chemical weapons, which the Army was starting to get out of the nuclear business, but this was still a lot of work to be done. There still is a lot of work to be done in different focus capacities. So that was my next assignment. It was sort of interesting because my first day in the Pentagon as a captain, which is pretty junior there. You're the point person on a particular issue, and obviously there are a lot of people, whatever the issue is, that you have to go up the food chain to get something approved. Well, my first day after having him processed, there was a discovery of World War I chemical munitions in Washington, D.C., where a housing development was plowing up some land to build some new houses, and they found these chemical weapons that were developed in World War I, which So my first day, I'm in the basement in the Emergency Operations Center of the Pentagon, working on this issue, obviously with a whole bunch of other people. But okay, this is sort of interesting. Only to be matched by about 3 weeks later, I was getting a haircut in the big, gigantic barbershop that used to be in the Pentagon, and I'm sitting, staring at the door. I mean, my chair was facing the door, and after about 2 minutes getting my hair cut, through the door comes Colin Powell walking straight toward me. He stopped about this close and sat in that chair right there. And like my eyes must have been, again, literally coming out of my head. But he wasn't coming to see me. He was coming to see his favorite barber. And they just picked up on the conversation that he had probably a week before. But for those who aren't aware, Colin Powell at that point in time was the rock star of the U.S. military and actually the U.S. government, having overall, not really supervised and advised the president through Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and he was still the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that time. So that was a pretty exciting story. And I went home and told my sister and brother-in-law were visiting and mentioned it to them. And my brother-in-law chastised me because he said, "Didn't you bend down and get a lock of his hair or something like that?" And I said, "No, it didn't occur to me at the time." But again, at this point, I'm thinking, interesting stuff goes on in this Pentagon place that people all say they want to avoid. But my first few weeks there were just sort of like, we're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. It was pretty fun.
And at this point in your career, you'd really already had some really different types of assignments. And I'm thinking with the 101st Airborne Division, you were with 105 towed howitzers, and then you went to Europe with the Iron Curtain and U.S. Forces Europe, and you had mechanized forces. That was a little bit of a change for you. And then you go to the Pentagon and start working. Well, you got your master's degree in nuclear physics, and then you went to the Pentagon to work nuclear, biological, chemical axis. So it's lots of different change for you, lots of new adventures, I should say, and opportunities. And then what came next for you from the Pentagon?
Coming out of the Pentagon, I went to Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, which was another eye-opening experience because while one's in a unit, generally as a lieutenant, captain, one generally mostly interacts with people in their own branch. So field artillery, obviously mostly with field artillerymen. At that point, it was almost all men just because it was a combat arms that was not yet open to women. Mm-hmm. There are women in now who are absolute rock stars, but I'm just kind of referring to where it was at that point in time. And but at the Command and General Staff College, what was great about it is one was put into a seminar of 16 people generally all around the rank of major, and they're all different branches. And generally there's somebody from the reserve component, there's somebody from another service, and then again, there's no other artilleryman to talk to in the room, which is good because you spend the next year learning and getting educated together and not thinking what an artilleryman would say, but what would a logistician say? What would a doctor say? What would somebody from the Air Force say? And that just made it this great experience where everybody's learning what's in the program of instruction, what the instructors are saying. What everybody's really learning is how to work together with diverse groups and teams that make the whole, the sum, greater than the parts. And that was a lot of fun. It was, and again, it fostered combined arms competence, and still does foster combined arms competence in the force. And it gives you different intellectual lenses with which to view problems. And you just can't use the same old tools all the time. You need to tap into the other expertise that's available. But it's only going to work if you ask, and even more importantly, if you listen. So that CGSC was a great experience, and the best year of your life if you believe what every CG who's ever been at Fort Leavenworth tells you.
Yes, indeed.
Yep.
And what came next for you from Fort Leavenworth?
I went to what's now Fort Cavazos in Texas with the 1st Cavalry Division, and as soon as I got there, I went on a deployment to Kuwait for 4 months when Saddam Hussein was acting up a little bit, and then he went back, and then he obviously a few years later he paid a bigger price. But it was, again, interesting just being plopped right in the middle of Kuwait, and then conducting reconnaissance all over the country on various contingencies on what might happen and where it might happen. And then after that, I went to be an operations officer and a battalion executive officer, and again, really enjoyed that. And again, so now I was on M109 A6s, which is a more modern howitzer, still 155 millimeter. And I was thinking when I got there that, okay, when I was going back to Germany, when I was a 155 battery commander that had a nuclear capable mission, so we had to train for all the standard missions, and then the nuclear stuff is not just like a regular artillery round and doing the same exact thing. There's more to it, and I was thinking we had to spend a lot of time on it because it's literally a no-fail mission, and because the consequences could be so catastrophic. So by the time I got to Fort Cavazos, the Army had gotten rid of all its nuclear weapons. They're all demilitarized. And I'm thinking, okay, we don't have the nuclear mission anymore. We should have so much more time available to us. And I think nature abhors a vacuum. I learned that when I was getting my physics degree. And the time was just as busy, again, because there's always something going on at that point. Again, some of the Iraq restlessness, the issues in the Balkans. We didn't have time to. No one was going home early, so. But that was a great 2 years.
And then could you tell us a little bit about being selected for battalion command and where that took you in the Army, please?
Yep, that's really the greatest honor one could have, at least on the track that I was going through. When I left Cavazos, I went to the Joint Staff for a couple of years and worked on some interesting issues there. And while there, I was selected for battalion command. And that on the Joint Staff, it was just interesting because you put together, it's almost like you chain together with your colleagues from each of the other services. Mm-hmm. So rather than the combined arms that one learns at Fort Leavenworth with all the different branches, with everything you're doing is with the services. And it's different from being on the Army staff. And again, that was just a great experience. But when you have that great experience and you've been selected for battalion command, you're ready to go to battalion command. You think you are, and a number of your peers are getting ready to go as well. So everybody's exchanging stories, and this is what I'm going to do, or this is where I'm going to prioritize. But the good news about being in the Pentagon then is there are a lot of, senior colonels or colonels, senior lieutenant colonels, and generals that will be more than happy to talk to you about their battalion command experience, which is, again, a great education. It was fantastic. So You've heard from lots of different people on things to consider, things that worked for them, things that didn't work for them. And while no two situations are going to be the same, again, it arms you with the intellectual tools with which to apply to a different particular situation. And I wound up commanding a battalion in Hawaii in Schofield Barracks, 105 millimeter cannon. So back to what I was on as a second lieutenant and a first lieutenant at Fort Campbell. So in one sense, it sort of felt like, okay, coming home, as far as the type of system, and it was a different system, but again, a lot of the principles are the same. Doing a lot of the air assault stuff, and again, it's literally one of those jobs where, okay, it's like pinch yourself because you were selected for battalion command, and then you're sitting in Hawaii, just looking at the scenery and going, so I get to command a battalion here. Again, they were both privileges beyond my imagination. It was when you're a lieutenant and you're looking up and this really old guy is your battalion commander, and you really think they're as old as dirt, and then all of a sudden one blinks and finds themselves in that position, it just gives you a slightly different perspective on things. Battalion Command was a fantastic experience, but the main thing that happened to everybody then was 9/11. So we were out training in the field. We would on a field training exercise. Most of us were still asleep. It was probably 4 o'clock in the morning, and getting ready to get up like at 4:30 or 5, or whatever. So we get ready for the first fire mission of the day, and I was awakened by the Brigade S3, the Brigade Operations Officer, and he explained what had just happened with the Twin Towers, and he said this. And when everyone's in an exercise, there's a scenario around it. You're not just randomly sitting out there in an admin mode. You're rehearsing for the Krasnovians or whatever are the notional enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So the moves make sense. It's not just physically being able to shoot a howitzer. It's the right ammunition and all the other things associated with it, then maneuvering like you would maneuver if you're actually in combat. And when the Brigade 3 told me what had happened, and he said, this is not part of the scenario. He just wanted to make sure I did not was dreaming something that's made up, or sometimes, again, there's just different stimuli just to paint the picture.
Right.
And then, like everyone else, we're trying to find out. We're still in the field. We're not even sure if we're coming out of the field. And because we were, again, since we were 6 hours behind, 6 hours behind when all the crashes occurred, we're trying to piece together, and also immediately using the military to go augment security around the different islands in Hawaii, because there's a lot of military capability out there in many different capacities, and it all needed to be secured. So some people getting pulled out of the field for that. And I get together my leaders after I had assembled with the brigade commander and his leadership. And I said, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. And there's going to be a lot of confusion and a lot of question marks for a long time. And I said, my recommendation, if they ask, is if there's nothing for us to do back in garrison, we need to stay here and get better. We just need to get ready, because we're going to have to go get somebody. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't ultimately what was decided, but it was, okay, sort of like you should train like your life depends on it, because it does depend on it. And nowhere was it more vivid than in Hawaii, where just down the road, Pearl Harbor, the one other place that had been attacked, not in our memory, but obviously in the collective memory, and it's just down the road, so this can happen. And we went and trained and then got ready, but in the rotation, my battalion wound up deploying a year after I gave up command in 2002. But again, it was all part of one of these, again, obviously a brutal reminder that we always have to be ready. And again, it was like the most beautiful day, and it's like you can't even imagine something like that would happen, and one cannot get lulled into a false sense of complacency. And that was the main event, because that changed. And right after 9/11, after securing all these different facilities, we started a different training plan focused on a particular area of the world against a particular adversary. We changed a lot of formations and the way we use them, because of the terrain that would be a little different than what we were used to. And that was that carried on through my entire time of battalion command.
Thank you for sharing. And would you also share, please, any examples or leadership qualities from your subordinate officers and your non-commissioned officers that really impacted you and facilitated the success of your battalion command?
I think one of the themes I've found in leadership is you can lead and get the most out of your people by asking questions and hearing what they're thinking, considering it. You don't always have to agree with it, but you do need to ask, listen, consider, then you make your assessment, and say, okay, well, I know you want to go left, but I think we need to go right, and then that will come out. Uh, One-way directive leadership, it's necessary when time is limited and one does, you've tapped into the relevant information. You cannot tap into all the information because there's too much information available, but it's opening I'd say the aperture, so the climate in the unit and the organization knows that I want to know what you think. I value your opinion, and neither of us has a monopoly on the truth and on what's actually happening. And I need your input just like you need mine. And that was, I found that to be, I did not give that many orders as far as just making some decree that this is how this is going to be. I mean, obviously, you make a decision, you explain it, and say, okay, I'm accountable for it. I am. If you don't like this, it's on me. And again, not done in a rude way. It's just saying we're all part of this. You know, leadership is a team sport. It's not just having one person that's got all the answers and all the insights. It's your unit's only as good as your ability to tap into all the many skills and perspectives that your people have.
Thank you. And let's shift just a little bit to Army families. And so having a family while serving the Army must have had some challenges, but also some truly special experiences. Would you please share with us a bit about Army families and your family experiences?
I thought it was great. Kids, again, it's sort of like fish in water. They don't know any different. Again, they grew up in an Army family and moved around, and they kind of knew every 2 or 3 years they're going to a new place, so there's a new sports team to root for, or there's a new park, or there's something neat in virtually every one of the places that my assignments carried us. And so it's focusing on that. It's not like, oh darn, again, they're not happy to have their friends separated, but that's the way we did assignments then. People would be going at all different times of the year. So it was just sort of, if you lived on an Army post in particular, or even in a community around an Army base, moving was just a part of life. So kids, they never complained about it. Again, I mean, obviously they might not necessarily, gee, I really wish we'd go to some place that I don't know anybody so I get to start over again. But they get some resilience.
Right.
And again, we need to do better at providing tools and not uprooting them unexpectedly, if at all possible. But it was good for my kids, and ultimately both my sons joined the Army, and I really didn't push them to do it. It was just, they just saw, okay, they just sort of saw when they looked up and looked at adults, mothers and fathers joined the Army, or or something related to it, and it was just natural for them. So one went in as an officer, one went in and enlisted. They each did a tour, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan. Then they got out on their own. I didn't push them out or encourage them to stay in any more than, it's like, whatever is right for you at this time in your life. But they just sort of, I think they just sort of had the muscle memory of going, okay, people go, they serve, they do what needs to be done, and life continues. So it's not a disruption. It's just part of it. It's not something that's foreign to your life. It's service is just what happens. And then right now I've got a son and a daughter who both in the State Department in a similar role of doing things mostly overseas, and it's just sort of, the natural momentum that I think the families of many military experience. And I think the number is around 80% of the people in the military have somebody in their family, somebody who's in their close family that has served in some capacity, and it's contagious. It doesn't mean it's all easy and all wonderful, but there's ups and downs like there are in anything. But again, on the family side, I think it makes most of the families, most of the kids are resilient if the parents are fully engaged with them.
Thank you for sharing. And so you've completed battalion command. What came next for you?
I went to something that was then called the Battle Command Training Program and was part of a team that went around the world and trained 2-star and 3-star staffs, sort of like what happens at the combat training centers, except we would go to the U.S. Forces Command headquarters in Korea. We would go to Puerto Rico, which was U.S. Army South at the time. We would go to U.S. ARCENT, which was 3rd Army at the time, U.S. Army Central Command. And then we wound up spending a lot of time at ARCENT because this is 2002, late 2002. And then we were there for about 4 months in Kuwait as they were training and preparing for what was increasingly looking like there was going to be a war with Iraq. And then rather than just us as trainers and coaches helping the staff elements work together with a lot of different units that they were not familiar with, and we did have some familiarity with that, we all got drafted by what was called the CFLC, the Coalition Forces Land Component Command. All the ground forces that fought in Iraqi freedom were part of the CFLC. And I was pulled in to the deep fire cell and be the chief of targeting and operations for about the first 4 months of the war. And so basically the heavy duty, sort of large scale fighting phase, and worked on the targeting and the daily air tasking order and coordinating all the deep fires for the invasion and then what came after. And when we left, when things were kind of apparently benign, and that I finished up the Battle Command Training Program tour and then went into the what's known as the SAMS Fellowship, the School of Advanced Military Studies, which is the Army's premier planning school. I was in the senior version of that course for my war college and spent 2 years in that, because part of it's the education part, and then part of it is being a seminar leader for a SAMS staff section of 16 majors that you have, and you get to challenge some of the youngest, brightest minds that are now future leaders in the military.
Thank you. And what came next?
From the fellowship, I went to a brigade command that was sort of a sensitive capability that I really can't go into it much detail, but again, all the same things work as far as interacting with people, listening to them, and embracing thoughts that don't seem to make a lot of sense to you, pulling them all together and getting the most out of your people is always your best course of action when you're given the time.
And could you tell us a little bit about the leadership traits that you were, what leadership traits really were the most important to you and that you look for in your subordinate leaders in your brigade command?
What had always struck me, even as a junior leader, was people have to be an effective leader requires somebody that has vision and willpower, and not just bumper stickers. Vision is knowing what you need to do and knowing why, and then the willpower is how you're going to get there. And it's not just hard work. It's being committed to the people who are going to get it done. So just because you're really determined to get something done, if you can't persuade the people on whom you depend, then it's not going to get done, or it's going to get done, and then it could be more damage done if you don't bring the people along. It's similar to the comment I was making about you can't be a ready and effective unit by being easy or being easy on anybody, but you have to take care of your people. So
Yes.
again, those are connected. When they get disconnected, then you've got a bad environment, an unhealthy environment, and one that's ultimately not going to succeed.
Thank you. And what was your next assignment or opportunity following brigade command?
Sorry. That brings me to my final assignment, was the director of the Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Center that eventually turned into the Army Counterinsurgency Center when the Marine Corps set up an irregular warfare center. And the Coin Center was originally put together when General Petraeus was at Fort Leavenworth, leading the effort on the authoring the FM 324 counterinsurgency doctrine that was used during the surge in Iraq in 2007. And he and the Marine Corps put together the Counterinsurgency Center because, well, lots of units across the Army and the Marine Corps were doing bits of counterinsurgency. There was no single focal point on how it's all supposed to work. And so this was pulling together lessons that had literally been torn up after Vietnam, and assembling the right group of people to put together a coherent doctrine, which is essentially the playbook for how a military engages in counterinsurgency operations and tries to pull all this together. The Coin Center itself was not huge because it wasn't trying to replace the Army Doctrine Center. It's not trying to replace the education that's all part of it. It was a focal point, sort of like a bee pollinating a lot of different flowers, and going to each place and trying to help make it better and take something back and put it into the whole. So we would go to Iraq or Afghanistan for either short periods of time or longer periods of months to bring some insights on some of the things that we were learning or discovering, and then to learn what's happening on the ground and feed that back into the feedback loop so that we collectively get better. And that's a never-ending process, but that was the overall purpose of this. And then I did that for about 3.5 years. I had decided that I was going to retire at Fort Leavenworth, and so when I finished it, the day of my retirement ceremony was the day after we got Bin Laden, which was sort of a pretty high note to go out on. And I still had a bunch of terminal leave left, like many months, but it's sort of like, okay, this is probably as good as it gets. And then I started getting emails from colleagues and friends of mine that said, so why is the Coin Center director retiring the day after Bin Laden got in? I said, I'll think of a good story someday. I'm still working on it, but it really was a nice way to feel good about a lot of things. Obviously, a tremendous price has been paid, and both from the attacks, the two major wars that we fought, and even what's come after. But that was a temporary. That was a good bright spot.
Thank you for sharing. And as you reflect upon your Army career, what Army qualities and characteristics really stand out to you, you really look back upon thankfully?
I think when I think about that, you kind of look at the Army values as the way people are supposed to be: the leadership, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. And I always used to, in my mind, ask myself, which one of those which comes first, or how does it lead, and how do you exhibit that? And it's the characteristic of selfless service always seems to me to be what distinguishes the Army or life in the military from other things. Again, and I know everybody says this, but it's true. I mean, you're committing to something bigger than yourself. Fairly early on, I realized that every decision what you make when you're in the Army could affect the life of somebody's son or daughter or brother or sister or mother or father. And you will never know that what you do or fail to do right now, what the downstream effect of that is going to be, if that contributes to somebody having a good habit, or somebody that doesn't look at, doesn't check things quite enough, and because you didn't educate them enough. And so one has to constantly think of, how is this going to affect somebody's life, because somebody could lose their life. Now, that can't paralyze you. You've got to act on it, but you have to realize it and give it the attention and the energy that whatever the particular situation is requires. And anything less, makes you could make you the accomplice to something that you really wish didn't happen. So I just think you always have to do that. And I think if you do look at that and say, yeah, we're on a team, we have a tough mission, there are challenges, here's the standard, and somebody could get hurt, you've got to do everything you can to mitigate the risk and best prepare the future. Again, I always found that educating people was extremely exciting, and it's, as a leader, whether officer or NCO or civilian, the job is not being awesome and brilliant and super skilled yourself. Your job is to bring that out in your subordinates, and you can only do that if you're educating them and training them and helping them understand the why. What's the purpose? Why are you doing this thing that doing something that doesn't seem to make sense, or we're doing something that's could be dangerous? And they're right. Here's why we're doing it, and here's how we're doing it, and here's how we're reducing the risk. But it's your legacy is not how all your particular accomplishments. Your legacy is the people that you leave behind, and continue to rise up and do even better things than you've done. That's really it's this circle that just keeps on going on. Much like parent and children, raising children, you're giving them tools every step of the way so they can use them themselves. They can make good decisions on what tool's appropriate for what particular thing. And I'm not comparing our soldiers to children. I'm saying there's a responsibility to educate and impart in a manner they can comprehend and act upon standards, values, and accomplishment to getting the mission done.
Thank you for sharing your experiences and what you learned and concluded. So you retired from the Army, and what did you do next?
Took a year off and strove to do nothing but travel and visit with family. And I just didn't want to roll right into, retire on one day and the next day, kind of jump right back into it. I just wanted to get a little space to decompress and enjoy, and again, spend with family. I wound up moving back to the DC area after about a year, and just started engaging with former colleagues who were in the area as well, and just comparing notes on what they're doing. And I really was not interested in going straight with any particular company on one particular line of work. I just wanted to try some different things. So I worked on some contracts that supported the State Department, Homeland Security, worked with some companies in the UK that were basically training units going into Afghanistan, the civil military teams that were doing that. And then I got a chance to go to Dubai and did some training with the Emirati military. Did that for a while. Thought it was really interesting, but I just sort of got bored because, again, just me. It was corporate world, and the Emiratis paid really good money, but it just became all about the money, and that just didn't sit right with me. It just did not. And so I departed, and I went back to Hawaii working on a Homeland Security related contract for the governor or the TAG, the Adjutant General, on behalf of the governor, trying to bring together Homeland Security, national security pieces. And there are many pieces that already exist, but there wasn't a coherent strategy to do it. So leading the strategy planning effort was a lot of fun. And then did that for a while. And then when noticed that the first grandchild was on the way, living in Northern Virginia, that was time to come back here. And almost simultaneously, one of these great coincidences in life, I got a note from our previous boss here at AUSA saying, this job opened up that the previous guy's been in it for about 12 years or more, and he's retiring. You might want to throw your hat in the ring. And I did. And this is where I am today as the Director of National Security Studies at the Association of the United States Army. And it's a job where, this is what I'd be doing partially in my spare time if I weren't working. It's kind of see how things that affect the Army, how they are in their bigger context. And it's not just what's internal to the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army doesn't exist for the U.S. Army's sake. It exists for the nation's sake. And trying to understand that is a full-time job for anybody, and I'm happy to be doing it.
Thank you. And you just answered the question I was going to ask you, is what do you like about your current work? Mm-hmm. So thank you for covering that. And as you reflect upon your Army career and what you're doing now and seeing now in your current position, would you recommend young people to consider serving in the Army today, and why?
I'd say yes. It's not a blanket statement. Not everybody needs to go into the military by any stretch of the imagination. Mm-hmm. But I would recommend that a young person ought to consider it, because it's got many things that you just don't know if you haven't had the experience. The parts that I liked, even if it was coming at me, even still at West Point, are you're immediately thrown in with young men and women from every state in the Union, every territory. So you're meeting people and working with people from everywhere. And it was a little bit of a shock to my system and many others at West Point. Like I said, I had grown up in Massachusetts till I was 16, went to New Hampshire, and at 17, I went to West Point. And my very first roommate in Beast Barracks, which is, again, it's basic training for cadets at West Point, and it's about as friendly as basic training too, or it feels that way. And my roommate was from Muskogee, Oklahoma, who sounded like he was from Muskogee, Oklahoma, and I sounded like I was definitely not from Muskogee, Oklahoma. And I remember our platoon sergeant yelling at us, saying, "I don't even know how you two communicate with each other." And it can but you have all these different experiences, and so basically everybody's, a bit stunned by what's happening. Everybody's a little apprehensive. Everybody's got the inner confidence, but it's getting a little bit shaken here. And I think, again, that's a life-changing experience, even if one doesn't even go in the military. But you're meeting all these different people, and you're getting these perspectives and go, yeah, I really have talked to somebody from Montana. And, and it's like, well, they've never talked to somebody from Massachusetts. So I think just as a broadening opportunity, it's great. It's the fact that it's a team. And again, teams, even though they try to do the things the same way every time, it all depends on the people. And being part of a team that is doing something challenging and worthwhile, and one can contribute to it, to me, that's the magic. That's the magic thing that you're looking for. Do something that makes a difference, and you agree with a larger purpose. You're not just a member of the team that's just sitting on the bench. You're getting in there and you're helping do what needs to be done, and you draw intrinsic value from that while you're helping the team do its larger mission. And I think that experience has got to be helpful, whether one stays in the Army for 30 years or if one just does their tour of enlistment and move on to do other things in their life. And that was I think I mentioned my experience with all my relatives, my grandfathers, my uncles, my father. Everybody did their time in the military. Yeah, they definitely shared some grievances. Bad things happened, but they valued the people with whom they worked. That was, and the fact that they were doing something worthwhile. It all added up to something good for people that have no idea what the military does. It contributed to their families, and so it's hard to convey that to a teenager or a young adult, that there is really feedback that you constantly get from just little things in life that go, yeah, I'm happy, and I was privileged to be part of helping be one of many that contributed to that outcome. And that's what I would try to convey. And plus, a lot of it's fun. Not all of it's fun. And sometimes even when you're miserable, it's fun, because I remember being in some really tough situations and looking at some of my colleagues and going, oh, I hope I don't look as miserable as that SOB. And I probably was, but that I didn't laugh out loud. But I was laughing inside. Everything on the outside was hurting. But I just think it's a life experience, and there will be good, there will be bad, and it's like any other endeavor. But again, this one is adding up to better national security for our families and our friends, our loved ones. And, one has to feel pretty good about that's explicitly part of why you're doing this. So, yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying yes.
Excellent. Very well said. Thank you. What concluding comments would you like to make with regards to our discussion and your life's experiences?
Very much related to what I just said. It's a privilege to be on the team of the U.S. military and those who support it. Again, there are many areas where we can do better. And again, our team comes from our nation's population. So we get the good, the bad, and the challenging parts from that. Obviously, we try to select people that will ultimately share the values of the Army in this case, and want to be part of that team. And every day of my time in the Army and now working around the Army and trying to support the Army, it's always easy to find something that you go, that is awesome, that is great. And again, to me, it goes back to, as I was talking about the Army values, selfless service. So when you see somebody do something that's selfless, and I'm not talking about like throwing themselves on a hand grenade to save their buddies, which is obviously speaks for itself, but little things that, no, it's sort of like I'll throw a block for you or set a pick for you. You won't even know I did it, vice versa. But when you get to have the perspective and see people do that, go, that was really good. And again, not dramatic. No one's looking for applause or a bonus. That's the kind of energy that even when you're tired, even when you're freezing, even when lots of things are going wrong, when someone actually just demonstrates selfless service, to me, a lot of the ills and the hardships of military life go away, because it says, we're in this together. I'm here to help you. You're here to help me. And we're both here to help the broader team. That's what kept me going and still does.
For sure. Excellent. Colonel Roper, it has indeed been a great pleasure and honor to interview you for this Veterans History Project. All the best to you, and thank you very much for your many years of service to the Army. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.